This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec live here at Bloomberg headquarters in New York City. It's another busy day, a busy Wednesday. A lot of the conversation coming out of Davos, including what President Trump had to say before the global audience. So we're going to get into that in just a moment. Having said that, we do have a stock market rally that kind of has fizzled, if you will. There are some concerns about tariffs coming back, so that's created some uncertainty, certainly in the trade. But we are going to talk about President Trump going to Davos.
Yeah, the president's threat on Greenland is stirring Europe's deepest divisions. We've got Marc Champion from our Bloomberg opinion team on why Europe cannot afford a throwdown over the world's largest island.
Did you even know it was the world's largest island? You did. He knows everything.
I've just found it's best to not answer sometimes.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. Anyway.
I'll let you... Silence speaks, right?
I guess so.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
We're going to talk a lot about Greenland, and certainly that has been a focus over in Davos. Also, is there a possible off-ramp for President Trump when it comes to this situation? A lot of moving parts. A lot has been said in the lead-up to those global meetings. Also, President Trump's National Economic Council Director, Kevin Hassett, on the Fed and the president's economy. We'll talk about that in just a moment, too.
Also, a view from the C-suite. Charles Schwab CEO Rick Wurster is back with us, a day when the company's stock is higher as a result of reporting the latest quarter's results. That was this morning. So a great program coming up over the next hour right here on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily.
Yeah, a lot of geopolitics once again. All right, we're going to get to it in just a moment. Let's get a check on the trading session. Let's talk about that rally. We're up, but not on at our best levels. Here is Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much. And here's what's going on. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. You mentioned Schwab. That stock up now by 1.1%. S&P up 35, up by about 0.5%, 68.32. As Carol mentioned, we are well off session highs, but still looking at gains after yesterday's rout for the U.S. stock market. The Dow up 322 right now. That is a gain of 0.7. NASDAQ up by 0.4, and of course, keeping it all in context, the S&P up right now by 0.5%. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares up by 0.7% with a 10-year, 4.26%, the 2-year, 3.58%. Spot gold is surging 1.8%, 48.47 the ounce. That is a record, holding above $4,800 on the precious metal. Silver, though, in retreat, down 1.2%. Spot silver, 93.47 the ounce. Crude just above $60 a barrel, up by 0.3%. And Bitcoin dropping 1% right now, 88,503 on Bitcoin. So the headline, the catalyst, President Trump saying he will not use force over Greenland and will seek negotiations. Bottom line here, though, stocks have paired gains. Earnings news, Netflix shares after last night's report tumbling now by 3.8%. Netflix at $83.96. Netflix down after earnings. Again, recapping the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all higher. S&P up 0.5, and for on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcast. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, so appreciate it. Charlie Pellet there will be back throughout the hour. Meantime, President Trump, his trip to the World Economic Forum in Davos, it did have a pretty rough start. You probably have heard about this. The government plane he was flying was forced to return to Joint Base Andrews in Maryland shortly after departing last night. It was an electrical, mechanical issue. Now, the president was able to board a replacement plane. He took off again. He did give his speech earlier today to a crowded room. What?
I was just going to talk about a 757 that the vice president usually flies on.
Right.
Instead of this typical 747.
It's a little bit smaller, I think. Or
it's a lot smaller. But he got there about 3 hours late.
And still safe, secure, which is what you want when the president's flying. All right, as Tim mentioned, he got there a few hours late. The speech may have done little, though, to appease some of the transatlantic tensions over the president's plans for Greenland, which he has been talking about over the past few days. You know that ahead of his trip to Davos. Here's President Trump earlier from Switzerland.
It's great to be back in beautiful Davos, Switzerland, and to address so many respected business leaders, so many friends, few enemies. As you've learned, when the United States goes up, you follow. I want Europe to do great. I want UK to do great. We want strong allies, not seriously weakened ones. Would you like me to say a few words of Greenland? I was going to leave it out of the speech, but I think I would have been reviewed very negatively. It's the United States alone that can protect this giant mass of land, this giant piece of ice, develop it and improve it and make it so that it's good for Europe and safe for Europe and good for us. And that's the reason I'm seeking immediate negotiations to once again discuss the acquisition of Greenland. The United States is treated very unfairly by NATO. I want to tell you that the United States is keeping the whole world afloat.
Okay. All right. Again, President Trump earlier from Davos, talking Greenland, talking NATO, talking about a lot of issues. He was talking about a lot of this stuff, too, in his lead up to heading over there, Tim. Meantime, we should point out a trade deal between the U.S. and the European Union is on hold after the European Parliament decided to freeze a ratification vote in response to President Trump's escalating threats to seize Greenland.
This all while European leaders are on a mission to salvage the transatlantic alliance with the U.S. amid the president's renewed demand for Denmark to hand over Greenland. It's a lot. Bloomberg Opinion International Affairs columnist Marc joins us from London on the future of the NATO alliance and why Europe cannot afford a throwdown over Greenland. This is inextricably tied to NATO and the U.S. relationship and the U.S. part of NATO. And I'm wondering if the U.S. relationship with NATO is nearing a point of no return.
In a sense, it is. I think, we see that it's on a trajectory that is going to be very hard to turn around. And it's, one in which the U.S. Increasingly disassociates itself from NATO. But the question for the Europeans is, they'd love to be able to, at this point, they would love to be able to, just say, do your worst. We will hit you back on tariffs as hard as you hit us. And the problem for them is they don't have an alternative to NATO and the U.S. role in NATO yet. And it's going to be very hard, given what's going on in Ukraine and given, the position of Russia. It's going to be very hard for them to kind of get together and, unite to say, yes, we don't care if the U.S. just pulls out of NATO and pulls the plug on its, intelligence sharing, et cetera, in Ukraine. We're just going to go ahead anyway. There are a number of countries like, Poland, the Balts, and so on that would not want to see that. And then on trade, you've got some countries that are much more exposed than others. So France, which is, somewhat less exposed, is taking a pretty tough stance and says we need to, launch this trade bazooka. And then you've got Germany, which is more exposed, Italy, which is very exposed. We don't hear from Ireland, but they are absolutely exposed. All of them would be concerned. So I think that, the difficulty for the Europeans is they're going to say, look, we want to stand up. We want to make a stand, make it clear, draw a line, support Denmark. They want to do all that. And at the same time, they're saying we need to stay together. Absolutely. We all agree we have to stay united. But then when you get to the point where you have to answer Trump, then, those things are very hard to reconcile.
I love this in your column, Marc. You say, but if President Trump is ignoring Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's advice never to start a fight that won't gain you much in victory, then Europe risks ignoring even wiser counsel from the Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu, don't start a battle you can't win. So it sounds like it's not great on either side, but it does sound like the U.S. has the upper hand here.
Well, that's the problem. I mean, in terms of rational argument, there's no contest. I mean, there's no, everything that Trump said today in Davos about why the U.S. absolutely has to have this, it's utter nonsense. So the U.S., throughout the Cold War, it was much more concerning for the U.S. at that time to have control of Greenland than it is today. And the way you know that is that the U.S. had 30,000 troops there in 17 or so different bases. So if what has the U.S. done today? It's got 200 troops there on one base. It just doesn't add up. There's nothing that the U.S. can't do in Greenland that it wants to do because there's a 1951 treaty with Denmark that says it can do whatever it wants to do. So it's not about that. It seems to be about something else. In my personal view, a lot of this is to do with legacy and wanting to be, the person who established a new dominance in the Western Hemisphere, the person who first U.S. president since McKinley, Trump's hero, to have added a significant piece of territory. McKinley annexed Hawaii. I think a lot of it is about that. And for the Europeans, it breaches all kinds of important international law, international principle. So they're right on all of that. The only thing the problem they have is that Trump's right about one thing. The U.S. has a lot of power. And the Europeans are both disunited and less powerful.
Marc, we're going to speak with Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics in just a minute, and we're going to talk a little bit about whether there's an off-ramp here when it comes to the president's rhetoric around Greenland. But before we do that, how do you think this ends? Does this end with the U.S. actually taking control of Greenland?
Well, I'm hoping that they find a way, that the Europeans find a way to let Trump save face. In which Denmark retains sovereignty of Greenland, and Trump saves face in some way where he can say, okay, now we're in control. I don't know, to be honest, how this plays out. If he really insists and keeps pushing, there is going to be a breaking point. And my suspicion is that, most of Europe will look at this and say, we can't afford to blow up NATO at this point. We can't afford to have the U.S. withdraw essential things that allow the Ukrainians to keep fighting. And so, Greenland is the lesser priority. But, I'm hoping that we don't get there and that they do find some kind of off-ramp that allows Trump to save face.
All right, Marc, thank you so much. Truly, truly appreciate our own Marc Champion over there in London joining us to talk about the situation in terms of the U.S. pursuit of Greenland. Of course, Marc is a Bloomberg opinion columnist, and I highly recommend you check out his columns on the Bloomberg. He's international affairs columnist here at Bloomberg Opinion. All right, we're going to stay on this story. We're going to stay on the president. We're going to stay on Greenland, the past, present, and future of the NATO relationship. Is there an off-ramp for President Trump? We head to the Bloomberg News Washington, D.C. Bureau. Bloomberg Economics Chief Geoeconomics Analyst Jennifer Welch. Jenny, good to have you here with Tim and me. First of all, what's your read on all of this? And let me add to the mix that we've got the EU Trade Committee's move to postpone a ratification vote on a U.S. trade deal indefinitely in response to President Trump's threats to seize Greenland. So what's the read on this? Negotiating, transactional? I think about President Trump. How do you see it?
I think all of the above. Certainly a very transactional approach that's bearing out here, including with his reaffirmation in the speech today that he is seeking to negotiate a full acquisition, as he put it, of Greenland. Rights, title, and ownership is, I think, how he put it, that he's not going to accept anything short of that. I think, though, at the end of the day, a lot of European audiences were both bracing themselves for a harsher speech and then possibly breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief, especially when President Trump indicated that he doesn't want to use force and he wouldn't plan to use force, that he's really seeking to focus on negotiations. That's a little bit of a shift in posture from what we had been seeing in the days and weeks leading up to this, where he wasn't willing to say that that option wasn't off the table. And I think what that suggests is that the path forward for European leaders is to use their private conversations with him, including today on the sidelines of Davos, to try and persuade him to the path of diplomacy and to try and craft some sort of deal that he can, as Marc mentioned, frame as a personal success, as a win.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because we just spoke to Marc Champion of Bloomberg Opinion about the motivation for this. He argues in his column it's not about defense. We have longstanding agreement with Denmark about the U.S. presence and tens of thousands of troops that served there in the last few decades, especially during the Cold War. In your view, what is it really about?
I think predicting what is really in President Trump's mind is always a little bit of a challenge. But I agree with Marc. I think this is about this broader question of legacy. This is something that President Trump talked about in his first term and also at the beginning of this term. When we were sitting here last year, he was talking about annexing Canada. He was talking about the Panama Canal. He's clearly fixated on this idea of territorial expansion as kind of a path to power and securing control over what he sees as the U.S. sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. So I think that it is largely about that. As you noted, the U.S. already has arrangements with Denmark and Greenland that grant us access, military access to the island. There's also past negotiating over other concerns, whether it be investment in particular sectors like mining to, for example, stricter investment barriers against U.S. rivals like China, which Trump has repeatedly invoked as part of these conversations. And that is probably going to be all of the conversations that European leaders are going to be having with him in the days ahead to try and forge a path forward that addresses the concerns that can be addressed without being able to cede the territory's autonomy.
You know, at the same time, Jenny, the president did say the United States cares greatly about the people of Europe. I want to see it do great. That's why issues like energy trade, immigration, and economic growth must be central concerns to anyone who wants to see a strong and united West. We want strong allies, not seriously weakened ones. We want Europe to be strong. So that to me sounds like someone who wants to see his allies also do well. You do write about an off-ramp. So what would be an off-ramp for President Trump in this situation?
I mean, I think the potential off-ramp is some sort of negotiation over a deal. It could look like a strategic compact. It could look like an expansion of the current arrangement with Greenland and Denmark that grants the U.S. more military access, more investment access, maybe those stricter barriers to, in particular, Chinese investment in the island, but that maintain not just the autonomy of the territory, but the relationship between the U.S. and Europe. As you mentioned, President Trump really highlighted the strategic importance of this alliance, but part of the risk here is that everything he is doing, this play for Greenland, is really putting that alliance at risk. And even if they are able to forge a negotiated solution out of this, the scars from this experience aren't going to be quickly forgotten in Europe. And they're going to have ramifications for that broader strategic relationship.
What kind of ramifications?
I think, for example, European leaders and European publics are going to look at the United States differently from now on, not just when President Trump is in power, but even after this moment. Because the United States elected him twice into power, how could you question, for example, the ability to trust in any future U.S. administration or policies that this is going to be a reliable ally and partner? And that's going to come into play not just in the trade dimension and not just in the military dimension, but really in a strategic play. For example, Europeans are often asked by the United States to take under consideration policies that might compromise their own interests for the sake of the alliance or for the sake of a broader strategic cooperation. Mm-hmm. That's something they're probably going to think about twice in the future.
Hey, just got about 25 seconds, Jenny. What's the economic cost of that? If there are scars from President Trump's actions here, what's the economic cost for the U.S. specifically? There is one, right?
There's absolutely one. I think including on many of his priorities, like getting Europe to adjust, for example, its policies towards U.S. tech companies. That's something that Europe would do only at the U.S.'s behest. And they're probably a lot more concerned about undertaking those steps right now when it's a point of leverage.
All right, going to leave it there. Jenny, incredible. Thank you so much. Bloomberg Economics, Chief Economics Analyst. Jennifer Welch, she's out there in our D.C. bureau.
Hey, before we go, a headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal. Anthropic's revenue run rate tops $9 billion. VCs are piling in. Check out the latest on the terminal. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing. Key takeaway at this hour, we're off session highs. Stocks have paired gains as tariff concerns return, weighing on investor optimism earlier after President Trump's comments on Greenland. The S&P right now up 29 at 6826. That is a gain of 0.4%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 294, now up 0.6. NASDAQ is up 0.2%. The NASDAQ 100 index up 0.5%, and the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares outperforming, up 0.7%. The 10-year at 4.26%, with the 2-year currently yielding 3.58%. Gold is surging $86 the ounce at a record $48.50 right now. Spot gold up 1.8%. Silver, though, heading the other direction. Spot silver $93.56, down by 1.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.2%, $60.47 a barrel. Natural gas up 24% right now, $4.84 per million BTUs. United Health Group plans to give profits from its Affordable Care Act plans back to customers in 2026 as Congress weighs extending tax credits for those plans. UNH on the ticker. Shares of United Health up by 1.8%. Earnings news: Johnson & Johnson's fourth quarter sales beat expectations. Shares of J&J, they're down 1.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Massar along with Tim Stenovec live here in our Bloomberg New York headquarters studio. Schwab shares, I'm just taking a look at them. Shares of the Charles Schwab Corporation, they're up about 1% in today's session. Stock is trading higher after the company reported earnings earlier today, this morning. It did report a surge in average daily trading volume in the fourth quarter, and that's happening as retail investors really sought to take advantage at the end of a strong year of the stock market. We did see some big moves there. Hey, to talk about the quarter and the outlook, great for Tim and I to be back with Rick Wurster. He's president and CEO of the Charles Schwab Corporation. He joins us from their headquarters in Westlake, Texas. Rick, great to have you back with us. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Nice to be with you, Carol and Tim. I always enjoy it.
Well, we are so glad to have you back with us. It feels like 2026 is off and running. I'm just curious, though. I want to talk about the last quarter, and you guys did note about clients conducting a lot more of their financial lives at Schwab, doing different things, wealth management, trading, and banking. So talk to us a little bit more about how the quarter wrapped up and where you saw them engaging more.
Well, it was a record quarter for us as a firm. Our earnings grew 50% year over year. Our revenue was up 22% year over year. And we saw net new client assets to the firm of $519 billion on the year, including an all-time record quarter in the fourth quarter of $163 billion. And importantly, what we are seeing is a bull market for convenience, not just in financial services, but I think across most industries. The way that reflects itself for us is a desire for clients to have more of their financial life conducted with one institution. And we've been the institution for many that they're turning to. We can help them with their investing needs. We can help them with their trading needs, with their wealth needs, with their banking and lending needs. And so by bringing together a client's financial life, we're able to help them more. When we do that, their satisfaction actually increases and our business grows. So it's a win for them because we're bringing convenience, and it's a win for us because we're doing more business with them and doing more to help them in their financial life.
You mentioned financial lives, and you just went through a whole list of things that people do with these apps and services. What about prediction markets? Can you talk a little bit about whether you're planning on exploring options for customers when it comes to prediction markets? It's all the rage right now, as you very well know.
And you thought we were going to warm you up. We weren't. We're just going to go right in.
I love it. Let's dive right in. Well, first, I distinguish between prediction markets and gambling. To me, prediction markets and the way they started were about being able to forecast like employment or inflation and being able to take a point of view or position on those, and that could somehow hedge or accentuate the positions in your investment portfolio. And I think as those were born, I think that makes sense within the context of an investment portfolio, and we're absolutely open to having that on our platform, those types of prediction markets. At the moment, it's not high on our clients' list of things they want us to innovate for them, and so we've been focused our innovations in other areas that are of more interest to clients. But I distinguish that between that and sports gambling. And if you look at 95% of the volume of what people call prediction markets is actually just sports gambling. And that's not something that we're keenly interested in getting into for a very simple reason, which is our mission as a firm is to make clients better off in their financial life. And less than 5% of people who go on to one of these gambling apps take out more money than they put in the first place.
Wow.
That's the complete antithesis of what we do at Schwab. Our clients' wealth is at an all-time high.
The level of advice we're giving them is at an all-time high, and the amount we're doing to try to help them is at an all-time high. So we'll leave the sports gambling, which constitutes 95% of the prediction markets volume, we'll leave that to the gambling houses, to the FanDuels, the DraftKings, and the Robinhoods.
So it's funny. It's interesting that you say Robinhood. We'll get back to that, because I think Robinhood would probably like to position itself as a competitor to Charles Schwab in a lot of areas. If we stick with the 95% of what you believe prediction markets is sports gambling, what is the 5% that is of interest to you that we could potentially see at one point on Schwab's platform? Give us some examples there.
Well, I think if you want to take a position on what the employment report's going to be, at the end of the month, or how inflation's going to print, those things could have an impact on your portfolio. If you have a big bond position, you may have interest in what's going to happen in the inflation report, and it's a simple way of taking a position based on a yes or no position, and so that could be of interest to clients. But the reason I think we haven't seen much volume in those, and the reason why 95% of the volume is in sports gambling, is because if you want to take a position on the employment report or the inflation report, there are countless ways to do that, and financial market participants are already doing that, whether it's in the bond market, in the futures market, through options. There's plenty of ways to do that today, and I think that's part of the reason why the true idea of prediction markets really haven't taken off, and why the firms that offer this have pivoted to sports gambling, because there's a lot more interest in that than there is in taking a position on the employment or inflation report.
All right, so then safe to say, Rick, if you were a betting man, I would guess that there's nothing in terms of a prediction market on the Schwab platform in the next year or so, or maybe never?
Well, we've been innovating at a very fast rate. 2025 was all about how do we meet the wealth, lending, active trading needs of our clients, and we had significant innovations in every one of those areas. We went to 24/5 trading for our active traders. We continued to make our mobile app even stronger for those that want to actively trade and do so via the mobile app. For our wealth clients, we launched new tax, trust, and estate capabilities, including an investment we made in wealth.com to bring trust capabilities directly to our clients. We launched a series of new capabilities for our advisor clients, and in particular really leaned into innovations around making it easier for them to work with us. All of those are things that we think are far more impactful to our clients' ability to grow their wealth than prediction markets. And when we go out and survey our clients about what they want from us, prediction markets is low on the list. So it's something we are actively looking at. I think at some point in the future we will have true prediction markets at some point, but it's just not high on our innovation list because we're firmly focused on those innovations that are going to have the most impact on our clients' wealth.
Right. Unlike, something we talked about when we were at Schwab Impact with you in November, that you had just done a deal which would give investors access to private companies. This was buying Forge Global. So I get that's more of a priority for clients.
Yeah, I think you go back to the 80s when I believe it was KKR that did the first leveraged buyout. Institutions have been benefiting from the diversification and the return enhancement from alternatives investments. And in the past decades or multiple decades, the really wealthy have also been able to participate in those return and diversification benefits. But the everyday retail investor has not been able to. And our Forge acquisition was really about democratizing investments in alternatives. We're now going to be able to bring it to all of our investors in multiple different forms and allow them to participate in private markets the way institutions and the very wealthy have been able to. And we're thrilled to bridge that gap and excited for what that could mean for our clients' wealth.
Hey, Rick, one thing we got to bring your attention to, it's just a headline that crossed the Bloomberg, and we're seeing markets turn around and rally pretty substantially on it. We see a straight move up on all of the major equity averages. We're now up nearly 1.2% on the S&P and up almost 1.4% on the NASDAQ 100. President Trump, who's in Davos and meeting with European leaders, says he won't impose Greenland limited tariffs on February 1st. But the headline that really, I think, got markets moving was that the president says he's got a framework for a future deal on Greenland with NATO. And I guess I want to bring this into the conversation because I feel like when Tim and I and you were together at Schwab Impact in Denver, it was pretty upbeat, I think, about the market environment and the outlook. And there's been a lot that's happened here in 2026. It feels like volatility is back. I'm just curious, Have any of the assumptions about the White House and policy and changes changed in your view? And I'm just curious what you make of something like this from the president that definitely has the markets moving to the upside.
Yeah, I don't think any of that surprises us. We're still within, a percent or two of all-time highs in markets. I think there's going to be geopolitical noise from time to time. If you've read the book, The Art of the Deal, I think it begins with starting big in your requests and then negotiating to something that is workable for both parties. And my guess is that may be the playbook that's followed here. But for our clients, we're not seeing an undue amount of concern. And this is a kind of environment in which we thrive because we're not just an investment app. We're so much more than that. We took 30 million calls from clients last year and answered them in less than 30 seconds. We're in many local communities across this country with actual people that are there to help coach our clients and how to navigate periods like this and how to see through the noise and be diversified and stick with it for the long term so that they can build their wealth. So whatever markets and geopolitics bring, we're going to be ready for it, and it's going to help us distinguish what we stand for here at Schwab, which is helping our clients grow their wealth.
We had some reporting in recent days about the New York Stock Exchange exploring ways for 24/7 trading of certain assets. And I'm curious, crypto kind of paved the way for that because a lot of people can trade crypto 24/7. What do you think of the ability for people to trade stocks 24/7?
Well, I think we're very open to that and would certainly participate. We're already 24/5 today. We see very little market activity or very little client activity outside of market hours. It's usually only a couple of %. The vast majority of trading happens within the market hours. And I think the market hours are a feature, not a bug. And what I mean by that is by limiting the market hours, you draw people in at the same time and create a lot of liquidity so that spreads are tight and trading efficiency is very high. I think the convenience of 24/7 is certainly very appealing, but we need to make sure that those trades are done in a way that makes sense for clients. And, as we see clients trade on our 24/5 platform, we make very certain that they trade in a way that they're recognizing the higher spreads, and we make that very clear to them. And they live with that for the convenience. But we just need to be careful as we go to 24/7 that we don't lose the efficiency of the market and the benefits of getting everyone into the market at around the same time, which is great for trading efficiency.
Hey, Rick, super quick, 10 seconds. Feels optimistic this year?
I think so. There's a lot, the economy's on strong footing. Market's been up 3 years in a row. Unless something changes, things look pretty good.
Well, we certainly look forward to coming back to you throughout the year and checking in on it. Rick, thank you so much. Happy New Year. Rick Wurster. He is the president and CEO of the Charles Schwab Corporation, joining us there from Texas. Coming up, we're going to talk a little bit about the Fed independence.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A leg higher for the U.S. stock market. This after President Trump said moments ago he will refrain from imposing tariffs on goods from European nations that oppose his effort to take possession of Greenland, adding that he has reached a, quote, framework of a future deal regarding the island. Stay with Bloomberg for the latest on any and all developments involving Greenland from the president. Right now, the S&P is up 88, best level of the day, up 1.3%. The Dow also at the best level, up now by 1.4%. Nasdaq up by 1.3%, with the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares up 1.9%. The 10-year 4.25%. Gold up $16 the ounce to $47.77. Up by about 0.3%. Silver now down 3.5%, 91.21 on spot silver. West Texas Intermediate crude up 4/10, 60.58 a barrel. Bitcoin up now by 0.6%, 89,950 on Bitcoin. Earnings news. Charles Schwab, as we heard moments ago, reporting a surge in average daily trading volume. Charles Schwab shares up now by 1.9%. And Ally Financial reported higher than anticipated provisions for credit card losses in the fourth quarter to prepare for the potential of soured loans. Ally up by 1.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Massar, along with Tim Stenovec, live here on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. Hey, as Charlie just mentioned, we just mentioned briefly before the break, President Trump, of course, at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos. And apparently he's been out on social media, too, between his speeches and his meetings and more, and something that actually moved the markets, Tim.
Yeah, the president out on social media saying that he's got a framework for a future deal on Greenland with NATO, a framework for a future deal. He said he would refrain from imposing tariffs on goods from European nations that oppose his efforts to take possession of Greenland, adding he reached a framework of a future deal regarding the island. With more on that and understanding what exactly his post on True Social means, we're joined by Bloomberg TV and Radio International Economics and Policy Correspondent Mike McKee. He joins us here in the studio. The idea of a framework and coming to some sort of agreement with NATO about Greenland, obviously the risk on assets are rallying right now. There's sort of a relief here, but it strikes me as the president sort of backing down from some of the rhetoric that he's had about taking over Greenland.
Well, I think there's no question about that. The president left himself no on-ramps when or off-ramps rather, when he said he would impose tariffs and that the United States demanded that Greenland be owned by the United States because the rest of the world said no. And he went to the Davos Forum today and he said, okay, I'm not going to use force, but I still demand that Greenland be ours. And then he came out of a meeting with NATO, which has nothing to say about the disposition of Greenland, and says, I have a framework for a deal. Well, I've got a framework to become a billionaire, as you were saying a minute ago, but I'm not sure.
I believe that was off air.
Hey, the mics are always on in the studio.
It's a future.
I have a framework
it's a
to
future
fly.
Framework, yeah. So the president, and this has been clear for some time, that he's going to have to find a way to climb down, and this seems to be his effort to back off on this, to taco this, as people would say.
Yeah, when I hear framework, Carol, I think of like the framework or concepts of a plan.
Yeah.
About healthcare, for example, something that is not quite ready for prime time, but is in an earlier stage.
Yeah, no tariffs, though, which is a good thing. Additional discussions are being held concerning the Golden Dome as it pertains to Greenland. Further information will be made available as discussions progress. I feel like you get those things when you're like, we're just going to put it out there and we'll deal with this later.
Well, the Golden Dome is a defense system, so
right.
NATO figures into that maybe in terms of deployment or how others might work with the United States to install it or operate it or whatever. But the physical ownership of Greenland is not NATO's business.
We did mention that the reason it also caught our attention is markets. The equity markets went straight up, and we did see, I think, the 10 and the 5 in terms of yields backing off a little bit. I mean, the concern was more tariffs, right? Or again, tariff uncertainty or volatility.
Well, you saw it yesterday. The markets went way down, and today they started to go back up again because everybody started to think, no, he can't do this. And he's probably going to chicken out the taco trade. And so people started buying risk assets again, and then the headline crosses that he's back down, and so everybody just piles back in again.
Does it? There was a story on the Bloomberg terminal that came out today. Denitsa Sikova and Isabel Lee writing it that got my attention. Wall Street's taco trade runs into problems of its own making. If taco means investors don't need to panic when Trump signals aggressive policy action after another, then there are no market collapses violent enough to spook him into backing down like he did on tariffs last year.
Well, it may be that the market reaction yesterday
was enough.
Gave him a little bit of a scare. But he's also in Europe with a whole bunch of European leaders. He's been doing bilaterals.
What happened in this meeting that made him?
And this meeting they came out of was with Marc Rutte, who's the Secretary General of NATO.
Right.
So he's met with other European leaders there. And we've also heard in the past 24 hours from Keir Starmer, from Macron, from Merz, and all the Europeans are saying one word: no.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's got no out for this, so now he's created one.
All right. We could go on and on about Greenland, but we're going to move on a little bit because
this sheet of ice. It's just ice.
Exactly. The president, we know, gave this speech in Davos. It was highly anticipated. The room was really crowded. It wasn't just about Greenland, although they talked about that a lot. He also talked about one of his next highly anticipated moves, and that was nominating the next Fed chair. Let's see what the president said from Switzerland.
And I'll be announcing a new Fed chairman in the not too distant future. I think he'll do a very good job. See, I gave away some of it. He did give that away. So we have something get something. It's amazing how people change once they have the job, but it's too bad. Sort of disloyalty, but they got to do what they think is right. We have a terrible chairman right now. Jerome, too late Powell. He's always too late.
All right, that, of course, was the president in Davos.
So it won't be Judy Shelton. He said it's a he.
Yeah.
She has a 1% odds on Polymarket.
Well,
right
it's no surprise because they had already basically said they'd eliminated the only woman who was being considered, McKee Bowman. So.
Well, we talked about this yesterday, that a story in the Bloomberg talked about kind of the next Fed chair is kind of like searching for a unicorn. There's so many things he needs to be, or she. Well, I guess it's not a she anymore. But I mean, ultimately, he's got to name somebody, right?
Yeah, ultimately. Otherwise, the chair continues to occupy the chair. And that's not what the president wants. He'll name somebody. I think he's just having trouble settling on the person who will come closest to the unicorn that he's looking for. And that's not clear because each one of them comes at it with some negatives. The president wants somebody who's going to cut rates a whole lot, but is also acceptable to the markets. And Kevin Hassett might not be too acceptable for the markets. And Kevin Warsh might not get along well with some of the people at the Fed and has also been a hawk. And then you have Chris Waller, who is in favor of lower interest rates, but probably a Fed institutionalist and certainly not a MAGA person. So each one brings some baggage that that the president may not like.
You mentioned Hassett, Kevin Hassett, certainly a Trump loyalist, has been considered one of the candidates. It seemed like he was sidelined by President Trump. He actually caught up with Anne-Marie Hordern, Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern, earlier from the World Economic Forum. Kevin Hassett, obviously President Trump's National Economic Council director. They talked about a lot of things, including Fed independence.
I was a young economist at the Fed a long time ago, and I worked with Alan Greenspan, and he was really, really careful about keeping the Fed out of politics and keeping the Fed focused on monetary policy and interest rates and the dual mandate. And even to one point, I wrote an academic paper, that he refused to publish for the Fed for over a year because it was about carbon taxes and BTU taxes, and he didn't want the Fed to get involved in that fight with Al Gore and Bill Clinton while it was still going on. And so I think that, I really regrettably, the bank presidents and the Federal Reserve members seem to want to have an opinion about everything every day, not just monetary policy. So, for example, you could go in, and right after President Trump took office, Austin Goolsbee gave a speech where he said, well, economists all agree that if there's a tariff, that it doesn't have an effect on inflation, it just affects the price level. But he said, here's why you shouldn't think about it that way. And I think that that's actually going into a politically dangerous place for the Fed. I mean, for sure you want to talk about inflation, but precisely then, right when President Trump's coming in and setting his tariff agenda, to have the Fed criticize him so vehemently, I think is inconsistent with the desire for independence.
Do you think it was appropriate that Jay Powell went to the Supreme Court today?
I do not.
All right, that, of course, is Bloomberg TV surveillance co-host Anne-Marie Hordern with President Trump's National Economic Council director Kevin Hassett from Davos, Switzerland. Anything new there from Mr. Hassett?
No, this is just Kevin doing what he's supposed to be doing, which is defending the president no matter what the president says.
Is he definitely out of the running?
He's not definitely out of the running.
Okay.
He's probably, at this point, because it's Donald Trump, he's got as good a chance as anybody, I suppose. We don't know what Trump is thinking, but Kevin knows better than what he was saying today, praising Alan Greenspan for staying out of politics. Greenspan enormously criticized for, in 2001, supporting the George W. Bush tax cuts because we had a surplus, we didn't need all this debt, and that was straying into politics in a big way.
Well, his simple answer when he was asked by Anne-Marie, is it appropriate that Jay Powell went to the Supreme Court today? He said, I do not, but you've actually have had members of the president's administration going to Supreme Court in the past.
Yes, we had the Treasury Secretary, Scott Besson, Jamison Greer, the trade negotiator, and Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, attend the Supreme Court hearing on tariffs. So if you want to talk about political pressure, you could argue that they're in the administration, but Jay Powell could also say he was there just supporting his co-worker if he wanted to.
Hey, just very briefly, Lisa Cook, her job safe?
I think her job is safe. I think we might even get a unanimous verdict in this case. But remember, they're only deciding whether to stay the lower court ruling that she can stay in her job. The issue before the court is not whether the president has the ability to fire her or not. It's whether he can fire her in the meantime. So this will probably get sent back to lower courts to decide the main question.
So not over.
It's not over, but it does look like she will keep her job. And the way the courts work, this could take an awful long time.
But this is a case ultimately if it goes back to the lower court about Fed independence and the power of the president over, or his power to replace people on the Fed, including the Fed chair.
Yeah, I was amused. Her lawyer, Paul Clement, made the argument today that if you remember the old Midas muffler commercial about pay me now or pay me later, he sort of made that point, is you can decide only on this narrow stay question now, but if you send it back down, it's coming right back to you, and you're going to have to decide sooner or later.
It's a lot. It's
Fortunately, Michael McKee can handle it all.
Yeah, I know.
He's international economics and policy correspondent for Bloomberg TV and radio, joining us here in the Bloomberg Businessweek studio. Mike, thanks so much.
All right, Michael McKee, thank you. Let's get a quick check on the trade, if we may, because we did see, as we said, equities shoot up on that headline that President Trump has a framework when it comes to, with NATO, with Greenland, also no imposition of tariffs. But you have seen stocks just now off their best levels of the session, but at or near their best levels, 1.5% higher on the S&P 500. We're looking at a gain of about 1.5% on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And you've got the NASDAQ 100, a gain of about 462 points, up 1.8% in the session so far.
I'm looking at shares of Apple shooting to session highs, just off of session highs now, up about 1%. Bloomberg's Marc Gurman reporting exclusively that Apple plans to revamp Siri later this year by turning the digital assistant into the company's first AI chatbot, thrusting the iPhone maker into a Gen AI race that's just dominated by OpenAI and Google.
Codenamed Campos. Does that mean Siri will finally work? Sorry, Apple.
Well,
it's just
you bring up a good point, and Mark's reported extensively about this. The fact that Siri's been was an early mover, but it's just been left behind, absolutely dusted by the LLMs out there.
I can't tell you how many times. Hey Siri.
Easy.
I know. There it goes.
Responded.
All right, folks. Let's stay on the markets. As we said, we definitely have bounced back to our highs of the session. I'm Carol Massar, along with Tim Stenovec. Let's get to some stocks, specific stocks on the move on this Wednesday. Bloomberg News equities reporter Alexandra Semenova in the house with us. What a change. I don't know if your name's changed as the market kicked up higher.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not at all surprised by this reaction, guys. When I was talking to people on Wall Street yesterday, it felt like everyone was familiar with this classic, I hate to overuse the term, taco trade. Everyone knew that Trump would probably walk back on some of his posturing. Everyone saw it as a buying opportunity. So this reaction is to be pretty expected.
Who was it yesterday? Was it Bob Michael who said that if the markets actually thought, the reaction was pretty understated given what we had heard yesterday?
Yeah, and I think he also talked about that the president needed to say something in regards to it. We actually have a story, I think, on the Bloomberg about some of what Bob Michael had to say.
Yeah,
right?
but it was just interesting. It was our conversation was a little bit about, okay, well, the market reaction is muted because people don't believe that he's actually going to follow through with something like
and
this.
Really important to note here, the foundation of the market rally over the last several weeks has been pretty solid. A lot of people saying that is not the type of thing that you see at a top where we have small caps doing well. We have the S&P equal weight outperforming. We had the rally led by sectors like industrials and materials. So it wasn't that very fragile tech-led rally. So when you get something like this, it's generally seen as a positive development, and it was a buying opportunity for most people.
I just want to go on because there's a great story on the Bloomberg about Bob Michael, who joined us. He's over at JP Morgan Asset Management, and he said the sell-off, this was yesterday's sell-off in markets, is a message to President Trump's administration to take action to restore calm specifically. And so he's somebody who watches the fixed income markets and over at JP Morgan. So interesting in terms of what he had to say, kind of a message or maybe messaging.
Okay, so what are some of the stocks you have on your radar?
In terms of individual movers, Netflix is one of the outliers today in an otherwise positive day for markets. This is after they issued an earnings forecast that disappointed investors. Of course, the culprit was increased spending on production and that deal with Warner Brothers Discovery. Netflix said that it plans to ramp up spending on movies and TV shows by 10%. It's also going to work with Universal and Sony on streaming. The company forecast earnings of 76 cents per share, which was below Wall Street's estimates of 82 cents per share. And it also will pause share buybacks to build up cash for that Warner Brothers deal. So investors really did not like that.
That all cash deal.
Yeah.
So you got to raise some cash. What?
Look, I think the investor reaction since October in Netflix's pursuit of Warner Brothers Discovery has shown one that they're not confident.
Yeah,
in the value of it.
Yeah, let's wrap this up already.
It just feels like wanting to win.
Sorry,
a
Grace.
race.
It's not going to be wrapped up for a while.
No, I know. Let's talk about Charles Schwab. We just had the CEO on. Really great conversation.
Really great interview and really solid earnings from them. They reported a surge in average daily trading volume in the fourth quarter, and it was driven, guys, by retail investors. I think it's time to have a conversation about how we speak about retail investors because they're often called the dumb money, but the last couple of years have shown us that they are anything but, always stepping in to buy the dip and always being rewarded for it. They did kind of miss on revenue, though clearly this trading volume was enough to offset that, rising 31% from a year earlier. I loved some of the comments that CEO Rick Wurster said. He said that he has been advising with the firm to tell clients to stay the course on investing through all of this volatility, but instead they have been buying the dips and selling the rips, which sounds like a very sage investing strategy. And also, as you guys mentioned, you guys discussed with him, I thought it was really interesting that they mentioned that they're monitoring the rise of prediction markets. It's really going to be interesting to see how investors are deploying their capital.
Not gambling, though.
Not gambling.
He draws a distinction between gambling and prediction markets. He said he wants to leave this. It was interesting. He called out Robinhood specifically. He kind of put them in the same category as FanDuel and DraftKings because they do sports gambling.
Yeah.
It was interesting. I mean, that's competitive positioning.
Like
too,
a fine line.
But that's what's driving so much of, the trade, the money, the volumes, if you will, is sports gambling or gaming. United Airlines, we got that earnings after the closing bell.
Yeah, those shares are doing well after they reported results that beat Wall Street estimates and also issued a positive outlook. That was the thing that investors were looking for, especially after Delta's was not so good.